Hey students, we're going to be talking about the rise of Nazi Germany and the actions taken that would lead to the Second World War. From early 1920s leading into the 1930s, authoritarianism was taking root in Europe. In 1922, Benito Mussolini would seize power in Italy underneath a new ideology he called fascism. Germans would cry out for leadership out of the hardships of hyperinflation, high unemployment, and crushed spirits. This would fuel the rise of Nazi demagogue Adolf Hitler. Both Hitler and Mussolini were veterans of the First World War and echoed one another in their complaints of the world. In 1933, Nazi Germany would leave the League of Nations and start to rearm its army and look to expand. The League of Nations was unable and some nations unwilling to take action and was falling apart. Germany and Italy would enter into an alliance called the Rome-Berlin Axis in 1936. 1 year later, Italy would leave the League of Nations as well after the League attempted to impose sanctions. Meanwhile, in East Asia, the imperialist army and navy of Japan were on the move. Japan would break the Washington Naval Treaty and would leave the League of Nations in 1935. In 1940, Japan would join Germany and Italy as allies. The world was on edge once again, and the United States would watch on comfortably across the Atlantic. The United States had had enough of European conflicts. Americans were all too familiar with the horrors of war. Tensions between the United States and Europeans were still high as the war debt was far from being paid. In 1934, Congress would pass the Johnson Debt Default Act, which would prevent nations that defaulted on payments from taking out any more loans. Congress would bitterly also state that if any delinquent nation was attacked, the United States would not intervene. War-tired and unemployed Americans did not want to be involved to the point where a small movement would lobby for a constitutional amendment to forbid war except for the case of invasion. Congress would respond to Americans' isolationist sentiments by passing the Neutrality Acts of 1935, 1936, and 1937. These acts would only activate if the president proclaimed that there was a foreign war. If done, Americans were not able to sail on belligerent nation ships, sell or transport munitions to belligerent nations, or make loans to a belligerent nation. This would only play into the hands of the Axis powers as they continued their expansionist aspirations. Hitler would increase troops through a compulsory military service and mobilize them to the Rhineland. This would cause France to immediately perspire, but would be paralyzed with indecision with Britain as to how to respond. Hitler would take this indecision from the Allied nations as a sign of weakness, and in March of 1938 would march into Austria and claim it under German rule.
Since the Treaty of Versailles was signed in 1919, there have been only a few really momentous days in the history of Europe. Mussolini marching on Rome, Stalin launching his first five-year plan, Hitler breaking the bonds of Versailles one by one. Today comes another such mighty moment, as Hitler's bond bursting finally carries Nazi expansion across the borders of Germany into the land of his birth. As officials pull down the frontier barriers, the political significance of these pictures is still too fresh in the minds of the world to need discussion. So without comment, we present the story of Germany's march into Austria, across the bridge over the river Salza into Salzburg.
The German jackboots would then turn to German-inhabited Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia. Alarmed, Britain and other Western European nations would hold a conference in Munich in an attempt to stop the expansion of the Nazis.
And then, a gasp of amazement and satisfaction runs round the world. The Prime Minister decides to fly to a personal meeting with the German Chancellor. The tension eases, as if the world had suddenly seen a gleam of hope in the darkness of despair. For behind those days of crisis has loomed a dark spectre. Yet the world has realized that war over 3.5 million people in the present land of Bohemia would be a folly and a crime. So at Heston, after 69 years of a busy life, Mr. Chamberlain makes his first trip in a plane. There's proof of his determination.
The German Chancellor, because the situation seems to me to be one in which discussion between him and me may have useful consequences. My policy has always been to try to ensure peace.
An agreement was made that Germany would tear away the Sudetenland and stop its expansion. A mere 6 months later, Hitler would take the rest of Czechoslovakia.
Then Dr. Hacha, president of Czechoslovakia, dismissed Dr. Tiso, who appealed to Hitler. Dr. Hacha himself went to Berlin, where he was obliged to accept the terms of Germany. Slovakia becomes independent, Czechoslovakia disappears, German troops occupy Prague. Bitter is the cup of humiliation which the Czechs must suffer. But in this turn of events, world peace is not threatened. Thus relieved, humanity may turn to those signs of constructive effort for peace which are accumulating around us.
Hitler, although an insane racist murderer, had a strategic mind for war. Hitler wanted to spread Nazi fascism across the European continent, but one giant could stand in its way, the Russian bear of the Soviet Union. In 1929, Joseph Stalin would become the dictator of the Soviet Union after centralizing power since 1924 with the death of Vladimir Lenin. The Allied powers had been attempting to get a mutual defense treaty with Soviet Russia to stop Hitler. Hitler would outflank the Allies with the non-aggression treaty in 1939. This agreement between Germany and Russia would seal the fate of Eastern European nations. Nazi Germany, with the threat of the Soviets out of the way, would immediately take action. On September 1st, 1939, the Nazis would invade Poland. Britain and France would honor their agreement with Poland and declare war on the Nazis, but were unable to send any meaningful help. Poland would fall in a mere 3 weeks. The Polish troops were being torn in twain by the Germans in the west and the Russians in the east. It was only a matter of time before Poland would fall. President Franklin Roosevelt would issue a proclamation of neutrality. Americans were extremely anti-Nazi and anti-communist, but were still anti-intervention. Roosevelt had his hands tied on how to aid the Allies. He was not about to send more sons to war, and under the Neutrality Act of 1937, the sales of arms and war machines was forbidden. FDR would summon Congress for a special session and sign into law the Neutrality Act of 1939, and that would allow European democracies to purchase war materials. The condition was that the Europeans had to purchase the arms up front and had to transport those arms themselves. This would avoid any additional debt and the involvement of American ships or lives. The overwhelming demand from the European nations would breathe life back into the American economy, delivering it out of the Great Depression. The Nazi war machine was as efficient as it was deadly. In April 1940, Germany would take Denmark and Norway. The following month, the tanks would roll into France utilizing the Blitzkrieg. The Battle of France would only last 46 days. France would fall on June 14, 1940. The fall of France and the images of Hitler walking through Paris woke Americans up to the reality that the war was far from over. FDR would mobilize Congress to prepare for war with the appropriation of $37 billion to build a world-dominating navy. Congress would also pass a conscription law on September 6, 1940. This peacetime draft would set the provision of training 1.2 million troops and 800,000 reserves each year. In August of 1940, the Nazis would start their assault on Britain with submarines lurking in the English Channel and the Luftwaffe in the air. The Battle of Britain would prove to be a challenge to Hitler. He originally planned to invade Britain with land forces in September of 1940, but the tenacity of the Royal Air Force would keep the German wolf at bay. Americans would begin to have sympathy for the British people. Eventually, supporters of Britain would create the Committee to Defend America by aiding the Allies. Just like the name states, the committee wanted to aid Britain in its fight against the thugs of Germany. This would satisfy both aisles of war. Interventionalists would be proud to aid the British by creating slogans such as "Britain is fighting our fight" or "Help Britain defend America." Isolationists would be able to support Britain without the use of war. FDR wanted to aid Britain in their fight with Hitler, but hated the idea of being tangled further with war debts. Instead, FDR would introduce the idea behind the Lend-Lease Bill. The idea was that Britain would borrow the war machines they needed from the United States and then return them when the war was done. This was furiously opposed by isolationists in Congress, who would say, "Who wants a chewed-up tank?" This would be evident with the effectiveness of German Tiger tanks. The bill would gain momentum with slogans such as "Send guns, not sons," and "Billions and not bodies." FDR would garner support by stating that the United States would build an arsenal of democracy. The bill would be approved on March 1941 with an overwhelming majority in both houses. In the end, with the war in 1945, the program would send about $50 billion worth of arms and equipment. The Nazi war machine had taken over much of Central into Western Europe and was knocking on the door of Britain, but the thirst for land expansion and blood was not satisfied. Almost exactly 1 year to the date of the fall of France, Hitler would invade the Soviet Union. The Nazi knife would plunge deep into the chest of Russia, nearly piercing its heart, Moscow. This move was most fortunate for the Western powers, as the Nazis were now on two fronts and distracted. FDR and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill would meet off the coast of Newfoundland and discuss the crisis in Europe and the menace of Japan in the Pacific. This would be the Atlantic Conference. At this conference, FDR and Churchill would create the Atlantic Charter. The Charter outlined the aspirations of Western democracies, including the self-determination of people in conquered lands, opposition of imperialist expansionism, and the creation of an international community to promote peace. This would set up the foundation of the United Nations. The Soviet Union would endorse the Charter later in the year. After the Atlantic Conference, the United States could no longer ignore the actions of Japan. Japan had been waging war in China since 1936 and was a formal ally of Germany since 1940. Japan was heavily dependent on American steel, scrap iron, oil, and gasoline. In 1941, Congress would finally place an embargo on gasoline and other sinews of war for Japan. The United States and Japan would enter into negotiations in November and early December of 1941, but the United States intelligence community had already cracked Japan's secret codes and knew their answer: war. Officials thought that an attack would be made in Southeast Asia and the Philippines or British Malaya, but they were sorely wrong. Japan was stalling American action with the meeting. Over the Pacific Ocean, Japanese Zeros were flying en route to Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. On December 7th, 1941, the United States would suffer the worst foreign attack until 9/11. Japanese fighter pilots would drop aerial torpedoes and crash their planes into American ships, destroying the entire fleet. When the attack was done, about 3,000 Americans were killed and ships sunk or sinking. Japan has succeeded in halting the Americans for only a short time. On December 8th, 1941, FDR would go to Congress to officially request for a declaration of war against Japan. A mere 3 days later, Congress would approve the declaration for war. Hardcore isolationists have been cracked and transformed into pro-war supporters. The land of the rising sun had awoken the wrath of the eagle.
I believe that I interpret the will of the Congress and of the people when I assert that we will not only defend ourselves to the uttermost, but will make it very certain that this form of treachery shall never again endanger us. Hostilities exist. There is no blinking at the fact that our people, our territory, and our interests are in grave danger. With confidence in our armed forces, with the unbounding determination of our people, we will gain the inevitable triumph. So help us God. I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
Alright students, that's it for chapter 34. Please make sure that you guys are reading your books, wash your hands, and do not touch your face, and stay indoors.